We're here. I don't know what's happening.
There it is. I'm
Hold on.
not.
Go back. Go back. Okay. Yeah. Hi.
Hello.
Hello. How are you?
I am good. How are you?
I'm doing well, Ben. It's great to see you. It is great
Yeah.
to be back.
Yeah,
Tell-
we missed you.
Oh, thanks.
It
I
was. I
appreciate.
mean, it was great having Karina on, and
Yeah.
hopefully we'll see her on again sometime. But we missed you, and we're glad that you're doing better. I mean, it's been a month, so
Yeah. No, in general, even if I was able to join the last one, it's still been a little bit since we've been able to have Bible study. So, welcome everybody back from our little, I guess, because of situations, because it landed on July 4th, a little accidental hiatus, you can say.
yeah.
Welcome everyone back to Bible study. God bless you. Thank you for joining us this Tuesday evening. You can be anywhere, like I always say, but you are here. So we're so excited to have you with us. We're so excited to continue this journey with you all. And like you mentioned earlier, Karina, I want to give a special shout out to Karina. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for stepping in for me. For those who don't know, I had like this crazy ear infection that my whole face was like swollen. It felt like Satan had his claw in my ear or something crazy, like a toenail.
Doesn't sound good.
No, but it was really, really painful. She stepped in for me, and I think she did an incredible job. You both did an incredible
She
job.
did an
So
amazing job.
yeah, I appreciate you, Ben. You did an awesome job wrapping up Kings. It was great. Um, and I appreciate both of you. So thank you so much for doing what you do. Thank you, Karina, for stepping in. And yeah, I'm just super excited to be back. Super excited to be with all of you. How you feeling, Ben? How's
I'm
everything?
feeling good. I'm feeling ready, I guess. But you're teaching tonight, so I didn't have to be as prepared as you did.
Yeah, I was telling my husband, I'm like, your girl is nervous. Feel a little rusty, just a little bit. But I'm super excited to continue the journey into the Old Testament.
Yeah,
Just
you could.
appreciate.
When I was preparing, I was like, "Wow, I missed it. It felt like it was a long time, and I guess it was. I mean, a month, but a whole month. But yeah,
Yeah. You know, it was been a little bit, and
yeah,
like you think like, well, skipping a Bible study, no big deal, but it ends up being a little bit. Ends up being almost a month that you don't get Bible study.
mm,
Just by having to skip that week, but we're glad to be back. We're excited to be back. We're glad to have you with us. Quick shout out to some of us that have joined. Tana Marie, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Evelyn, Ben's wonderful wife, thank you for joining us. My husband's on here too. Um, God bless you, babe. Love you. Thank you for joining us. Lindsay, we love you. Thank you for joining us too. Um, yeah, we're just so. If you don't see someone that you usually see or that you haven't seen for a while, whoever comes to mind,
yeah,
tag them, share this video, invite them to join us as we continue this journey into the Old Testament. Um, which, before we start, I guess, Ben, if you can start us off with a quick prayer, greatly appreciate that. That'd be
absolutely.
wonderful.
Heavenly Father, we've come together remotely together to explore, to dive into, to listen to, and understand your word to us. We ask that you will um, guide our minds and guide our hearts as we seek to receive, and we yearn after your wisdom, and we yearn after understanding you and your character and your promises and your faithfulness. And we thank you for providing this word to us, providing us minds to understand it and hearts which wish for it. And we thank you for all of these things in your son's name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much. Um, and yeah, like I said, you did an amazing job wrapping up Kings. So that brings us to, in the order of our Bibles, the next book that we're getting into is the book of Chronicles.
Yeah.
Um, so our Bible splits it up same way it does with with
Kings and
King
Samuel.
Samuel. It's
Yeah.
split into two parts just because of the length of the scroll. But Chronicles is just one book, it's one scroll, um, but our Bible split up into two. So Chronicles, it's mostly repeated context from the books Samuel and Kings, which we've been through, which we got in depth with. So because of this, as Bible readers or us as readers in general, we start reading this. First thing we bump into are names we recognize, like
Yeah,
genealogies and all these things, and we start seeing things that we've gone through. We might be
especially when it's placed right after Samuel and Kings, which is where most of the repeated content is from.
exactly. You might be tempted to be like, man, I really have to read this stuff again? Like, can I just skip this? But I'm here to encourage you to read through Chronicles. And today we'll try to provide you with a new lens to do so in. Because it is a unique and important book. It's not just something that repeats things again, right? I love Bible Recap, Tara Lee Cobble. I recommend her highly, especially for the times when you're reading the Bible and you're like, I just, how am I sure that I really understood what I read? Like I'm understanding really clearly what's going on, like a more straightforward layman's kind of sense. Bible Recap is great. She just literally, it's in the name, she recaps the Bible and it kind of generally tells you what is going on and kind of connects this little threads, kind of like what we're trying to do. That's those threads as to like, we also hear about this in there and here in this book and in this chapter. Um, but I heard her say something really cool about Chronicles, and she said about Chronicles and about Samuel and Kings. She said, think of Samuel and Kings as a Netflix docuseries and think of Chronicles as a biography, like something you see on the History Channel or something
Mm,
like that, right? So,
mm.
and like she goes, like just because of the writing style and the way Chronicles does read, and it's actually gonna feel that way, I guess, too, because you are reading a kind of a recounting of the stuff you just read, in a sense. Um, just the way it flows, it feels more of like a reference, like a biography, a history book.
Yeah, and if everyone remembers from Kings, and that's something I emphasized was that Kings is looking forward or really looking back from the exile. So it's got this focus going up into the exile, but that's not the perspective that Chronicles is looking at the same events, but it's looking at it from a different point in history, and that affects what events it focuses on and how it perceives those events. And so it's actually, while it's repeat content, it's really a unique way to see the same events being viewed from different moments in Israel's history.
Yeah. And he said something key there from a different point in time, a different timeline. So, like in the traditional Jewish ordering of the Old Testament, Chronicles isn't after Samuel and Kings. It's
Right.
the last book. It comes after all the prophetic books, right? All the
Mhm.
major minor prophet books. It's the last book because it summarizes all of Jewish scriptures. So this author is speaking from a place of not living right after the times of Kings and Samuel and Kings. He's living in the times way after that. Like it's the last book
Yeah.
that summarizes all the Jewish scriptures. So you know, so much so that the first word in this book in Chronicles is Adam. So it
Adam.
goes from the beginning, all the way from the beginning, Adam,
Yeah.
and the last paragraph announces the return of Israel from exile. So this person
Mhm.
has already, they maybe themselves went into exile, but that has already happened in their history of their
Right.
people, right? They've already returned from exile. Um, a lot of things that we haven't read about, that we, as I'm talking about us that have been doing this journey through through the Old Testament and
Mhm.
doing an order, we haven't hit it yet. This
Right.
person has lived through it, or had their family has lived through it, or they have history of it.
Yeah. So that's why it's like I think it was really useful for me to realize that of when you're reading Kings and in a way even Samuel, those narratives are being looked at in light of the exile. Um, Chronicles is being looked at in light of the return from the exile, and
Yeah,
so that's why there's a very different tone there.
yeah, for sure. So because of that, because it can get kind of like when you're reading it in like the order that we have in our Bible, and you don't know that, then you start reading the major and minor prophets, and you read these other books like Jonah, and you read just other books like Esther, things like that, right? Um, if you don't know that, if you don't know like where they are, where this person, where the author is, like the timeline where there is, or where in the timeline of Israel's history they're at, it can get that'll one probably decrease the interest of wanting to read it, thinking it's just repeating everything you just read, right? And two, it can get confusing because you're
Right.
like, wait, where are we? Where's this person coming from? What point of view are they at, or where they coming from? So because of that, I wanted to just kind of briefly go through, show the timeline of Israel's history, um, from where this author is covering, basically where Chronicles is covering. So
Okay.
Chronicles, um, also like, well, yeah. So where Chronicles is covering. So Ben, if you can put up the timeline, I have 3 different slides here. Let me just hide this banner here, but really quickly we'll go through it, and it's going to help you take a screenshot if you need it. It's going to help you just understand what has gone on in Chronicles and kind of what has happened for this in this author's history, basically the history of his
Mhm.
people of Israel. So very beginning, circa 2000 BC, God made an everlasting covenant with Abraham, which continues through Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants. They will become a great nation. Those who bless him and his descendants will be blessed. Those who curse him and his descendants will be cursed. All the nations of the earth will be blessed through them. The land of Canaan will be their everlasting inheritance. So you see their Genesis, right? That's like covering Genesis. And then if you can read the rest of them, actually, that would be
Okay. Yeah, sure. So circa 1400 BC, the Israelites enter the promised land. So we're talking like Joshua, right?
yeah,
Prior to that, they had been delivered from the hands of the Egyptians and then spent 40 years wandering the desert because of unbelief. So Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Through the Mosaic covenant, they had been given the Torah and separated to God as a holy nation. I guess that's sort of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, right?
yeah,
And,
yeah,
and the 12 tribes of Israel are allotted their portion of territory.
yeah. This is Torah. This is definitely Torah.
Yeah.
And
uh,
that's, yep,
Circa 1000 BC, King David conquers Jerusalem and makes it the capital of the kingdom of Israel. God covenants with David and that his dynasty would be an everlasting one in 2 Samuel. His son Solomon builds the temple. The Lord declares that his eyes and his heart would dwell there. And that's, of course, in Kings.
yeah,
Circa 920 BC, Israel is divided into 2 kingdoms. The 10 northern tribes rebel against the Lord and set up an alternative religious system. The tribes of Judah and Benjamin remain faithful to the Lord for a while. A remnant from the 10 northern tribes joins the 2 southern tribes, known as Judah, to worship the Lord in Jerusalem. So that's also Kings.
yeah.
And circa 720 BC, the 10 northern tribes are taken into captivity in Assyria. By this time, judgment has been prophesied against Judah for the rebellion against the Lord.
The end of Kings.
Right?
Yeah.
Second Kings.
Yeah.
586, circa 586 BC, the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. The third wave of captives, the first one being around 606 BC, is taken into exile in Babylon. A 70-year exile had been prophesied by Jeremiah. Circa 536, the first wave of Jewish exiles returned to Jerusalem, and with the permission of King Cyrus of Persia, begin to rebuild the temple.
Yeah.
So it's already kind of like, wow, like we left off at Kings and they were going into Babylon. They were going into exile in Babylon and Assyria, and so now we're learning, oh, they're coming back from Babylon and Persia. Like, what happened?
Yeah, like they got exiled twice. Like what's good? So then that's why it's important.
Yeah, but
That's
there's story there.
Yeah, there's so much story there, and as we go on our journey into the Old Testament, we're gonna get into the prophets. We're gonna get to the major and minor prophets. So we're gonna read about that time. We're gonna get into that time, but it's important to understand that the author of Chronicles, they've already passed that time.
Right.
That's part of their history. They already know what happens there. They already know what the prophets have said. They already know when they came back from exile. They already all that's already passed. So it's very important to understand that, to know that.
Which does make it a cool, like it is cool to talk about it now, because while it's covering events up till now, it's also giving us this anticipation of events we haven't quite seen yet if you're just reading the Bible as it is in the Christian Old Testament. Um, so yeah, I'm just assuring everyone that we're going to get to all that. It is the journey through the Old Testament. So
Yeah. So if you want those timelines, I would go back and screenshot them. Or
mhm,
if you know me personally, you want to reach out to me, I'll send them to you. No problem. But it's very important to know where we're at timeline wise in Israel's
yeah.
history, where this author is at timeline wise. So about the author, we don't know who authored the book, but based on again on the context of this book, we believe that it was written sometime by someone who lived a couple hundred years after the Israelites returned from the Babylonian exile. So, and I've seen other commentaries. We don't know their name, but I've seen other commentaries call the author the chronicler. It's like, oh, that sounds like a
The cool name.
superhero, the chronicler.
The Chronicle.
And like I said, kind of a spoiler alert, we will read in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah of a prophetic hope, which is the rebuilding of the temple and the rebuilding of Jerusalem, that God will come and live among his people, and that the Messianic king would come and rule all the nations peacefully.
Mm,
But again, just putting yourself in the perspective of this author, understanding the context, the timeline. Here we have this author of Chronicles living at a time where the temple and Jerusalem have already been rebuilt for some time.
mhm,
Yet,
mm.
yet there's no Messianic king, and there's no peaceful rule, and Israel's still a mess.
Right. It's like if you just hear they're back from exile, they're back in Jerusalem, they rebuilt the temple. That but this author is really obsessed with some future promise. It's like, well, what's going on? I thought you isn't that everything that we wanted, right?
For sure, you know? So, like, what the author of Chronicles has done is reshape these stories of David and Solomon and the kings of the past in order to provide a message of hope for the future.
Mm,
So, now that we understand that, now we're ready in that perspective to really take on Chronicles. And now we can probably start to see that it's not just some recap book of something I've already read, right? So, just really quickly, also just to give a heads up too, we're gonna have some discussion questions. So stay tuned, stay connected. We'd love to hear your feedback. Let someone you don't see know, like, hey, we get to answer questions. We're gonna have. I really want to open up conversation and discussion, especially in a book like this that can seem like it's recapping a lot of the stuff that we've already uh, read through. I think it's also an opportunity to have some good discussion. So tag your friends, let them know we're going to discuss, and be ready to discuss. I'd love to hear from you guys at home, the audience at home, and from you too, Ben, of course, obviously, my partner here. But if you can put up the slide that shows the structure or the outline of Chronicles, all right. So we see here Chronicles again split into two scrolls because of the scroll length, or two books because of the scroll length. But this is generally the structure of it. First Chronicles chapters 1 through 9, lots of genealogy is going on.
Starts
Um,
out really exciting.
yes, it may not sound so exciting, but there's so much in there, and we'll go over that, like so much good stuff. Then it's sectioned First Chronicles chapter 10 through 29. We hear stories about David. Again, some stories that we feel like we heard before. We'll get some when you read it on your own. You'll get some things that you haven't seen before, um, but that's generally what it's covering: stories about King David. And then Second Chronicles chapters 1 through 36 are about the kings in Jerusalem, about the kings, um, and just recapping again some things that have happened with them as well. So that's basically the structure of Chronicles. Um, so we'll get into it. I don't know if Ben, you want add anything before we start getting into it, or
No, no, let's go.
all right, let's go. So First Chronicles chapter 1 through 9. That's what we said before, genealogies. So we do get a long list of names from Adam. We even get the genealogy of Saul, King Saul, to King David. And again, this might seem repetitive and even boring, but it's actually very, very important. The author, what they're trying to do, their goal, their objective is to summarize the storyline of the Old Testament by naming all the key characters of the Old Testament, right? And by doing this, the author is shaping these genealogies to emphasize or point to two key genealogies. First one is the line of the promised messianic king. So that's basically tracing the line of Judah, the tribe of Judah that leads to King David, to whom we've already read in Samuel, the messianic promise was given. And the second genealogy, key genealogy that is pointing to is the priesthood, which are the descendants of Aaron and those who served in the temple. So look, just from the recap of these genealogies, we can see two clear themes. There'll be three key themes today, and already from the genealogies we have two of them. um, so we see the emphasizing Chronicles. The first key theme is the line of the promised messianic king, or the coming of the Messiah. Um, and the second key theme, which I have it wrong here, I'm gonna change it really quickly, Ben.
Okay.
I was like, I was obviously had my mind on something else.
No, it's all right. It's
All right.
actually, yeah, I know when it's so intimidating every time we see genealogy because it's just a bunch
Yeah.
of names that we don't know how to pronounce very well.
Which,
Uh,
which I honestly would like to see, guys. I don't know. And now I'm worried about what I have at the end. Oh my gosh. But anyway, um, what I put on this slide because I'm like, oh no.
that's all right. I've done that too.
So let me just update it to what I really want. I'm being real here, guys. We're being real. We make mistakes. We're human.
Hmm.
Um,
But
so
I was just gonna say that you know the genealogies are really intimidating. But I know that even when I started reading them, with if you're paying attention, you start to like see things that at least for me were kind of unexpected, even in the
yeah,
genealogy of like of just like, oh, I thought this would just be a genealogy of like, oh, this is just the line of Israel and David,
yeah,
but it actually tells you the heritage of lots of other lineages.
yeah. So I'm just looking at the last slide that shows the key themes, and I'm realizing I did put the wrong thing in there. But these are the real key themes, okay, that I'm going to show you. If I can edit the other one, I will. If not, we'll just make a banner with the key themes for you guys. But the first key themes that we see, the first two key themes in these genealogies, the first one is the coming of the Messianic King. And the second key theme we see in these genealogies is the hope and future of the temple. So just in that, just in this, what seems to be boring list of family names and people, we already see two of the key themes that we encounter in Chronicles.
Mm.
So that in itself shows you that it's something that you could be tempted to skip through, but I encourage you not to. Um, so, but as we read through the these genealogies, as we're reading through Adam and Abraham and everybody, right? We bump into this name of this man named Jabez, and we basically bump into this man Jabez praying. He's how he has we it explains that he's praying to God. Um, and then if you can read that, I have that here, have that in the comments. So
Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. His mother had named him Jabez, saying, I gave birth to him in pain. Jabez cried out to the God of Israel, oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my territory. Let your hand be with me and keep me from harm, so that I will be free from pain. And God granted his request.
So I was telling you, Ben, like in the Bible study for the Bible study, that there's this really popular book that I saw growing up called The Prayer of Jabez, right?
Hmm.
And I even heard like there's songs written about this prayer. Like that seems so honestly when you're reading it, for me, I guess for me, in my opinion, this is my opinion, it just seems like kind of random after reading about these families, right? Like you're just reading about this man Jabez, and what you know about him is that he prays this prayer to God, right? And I'm like, man, I remember this book. I remember it being translated in like 15 different languages. I remember um, these songs. There's a song called "No Limits" by Israel New Breed, and he's based it on this. It's like no limits, no boundaries, enlarge my territory, all that stuff. And I'm like, man, over these basically these two verses, right? Um, and I'm like, wow, what a thing to bump into, right? So again, we'll bump into genealogy and we'll want to skip it, but this is just what I want to highlight this because this is one of the reasons why we shouldn't do that. Because this right here, these two verses here, tell us a lot about, for me, it tells me a lot about prayer and about how God responds to prayers. Um, because we read from this passage, we see that Jabez, what we read here is that Jabez was more honorable than his brother. So what does that tell us? Jabez is an honorable man. We see he's praying, he's seeking God, right? We also see here that his mother gave him his name Jabez because it's saying I gave birth to him in pain. His name means sorrow or pain. So what's interesting too is that his name means sorrow or pain. We read here that he's asking God to keep him from harm so that he will be free from pain. Right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so you read these like just from these two verses, you get all of that, right? And we see him that so you understand too because him being an Israelite, he knows that sin brings harm, so he's asking God to keep him from harm, and he's prays for God to enlarge his territory, which generally means to give him more land. So for me, the mention of this man and this prayer stands out as a reminder of what God desires for Israel to be with them, go before them, and enlarge the territory. Literally, give them the promised land, right? To give them the promised land. Um, if they were to seek Yahweh or pray and desire to flee from sin, stop harming each other, and choose to obey Yahweh, that He will go before them. And we read it. We read these examples, like we've seen it in the Torah and these books that we've already gone through. That at their times of obedience, God has been faithful and has gone before them. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah.
so in the middle of this genealogy, we have like this example of this prayer, which gives us honestly, we bump into the third key theme pretty quickly here. God hears our prayers.
Mm.
Because then you have this prayer from a man who trusts God, right? Who is praying for himself, but in a righteous way, which is the prayer that God receives because it's a prayer that reflects God's heart, not only for Jabez, but for his people, right? So, and he's also asking for more land, but God doesn't rebuke Jabez for asking for more land. And sometimes people look at that and be like, well, he's asking for land. Isn't that kind of selfish? Kind of a selfish prayer there too. And the reason why I wanted to point this out too and why it was important to me is because I sometimes struggle with praying. And I know I'm not alone in that. I know many people struggle with praying sometimes. Not just for other people. I actually find it easier to pray for other people. What I struggle more with is praying for myself. And the reason why is because, and I don't know if anyone could feels me at home or could say, yeah, I understand where you're coming from, um, is because sometimes when I pray for myself, I question, where are my motives? Am I asking for this because I have selfish motives? Am I praying for the right things? Am I praying with the right heart? Struggling with self condemnation, right? But Jabez's prayer shows us that even prayers for ourselves can honor God. And what matters or what God looks for is prayers from a heart that trusts Him and that knows that He's the source of all good things, from victories to territory, like He was asking for, to a desire for righteousness. Like God can take all of our prayers. I think, and with me, what I showed was focusing on those things. Like, am I being like, what is the motive of my heart? What's the position of my heart? And I'm not saying those things are not important, right? But God can take my prayers. God can take your prayers, can take our prayers, and He can sift through them. And He knows what kind of heart we're coming with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And He can faithfully and righteously and rightly respond yes, no, or wait to whatever is best in each unique situation. So just this little part of the genealogy shows us that God receives the prayers from a heart that trusts and honors him. And that's just 2 verses in a section that we probably would pass over.
And it kind of comes out of nowhere. You're reading names and names and names, and then it tells you this very quick story, and then goes right back to telling you more names. And so it kind of, if you were reading through it, it jumps out like, whoa, wait, what just happened? Why did it just tell me the story? And it goes to show that while we struggle we may struggle, especially as a modern Western audience, that the author is being very intentional, and he's putting things and placing them intentionally. He doesn't have time, he doesn't have space and ink to spare, right? So it's important to remember that there's an intentionality to everything, and even when we have difficulty knowing what that intention is. And I think that for me, seeing these sections really just reminds me of that, because I'm like, that, like, someone decided to put that there.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there was a thought that went behind that, right? There was an intention to that, right? And it reminds me that everything around it also had an intention. All of the names has an intention, right?
Yeah.
So it's good to remember when we're being good readers of literature.
For sure. Which will bring us to our first discussion question tonight. So people at home, get ready. Audience.
Oh, yeah.
First discussion question. Why is genealogy important? So based on what we just discussed, why is genealogy important? Why shouldn't we just pass by it? Like, what have you gotten from our conversation so far, Ben? Like, or from what we've learned so far?
There's like 9 chapters of genealogy in Chronicles. Like, why did an author spend so much effort? Right? This isn't like that. This would be a lot of genealogy that I would feel tired of writing, even in a Google document, let alone on parchment. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
This is very important to the author. And I think that personally, like, there's multiple facets, there's multiple levels, I think, to what's going on there, most of which I'm completely oblivious to at this moment. But yeah, as we're waiting for people to respond, I will give my own sort of response into it. That one, what's happening is that it's reminding us of the story so far, in that it's reminding us of the characters and of the descendants. I mean, it's been a genealogy. I mean, what was like one of the first promises that was given was to the woman that said that there would be a snake crusher that would be a descendant of the woman, which means that genealogy is going to be important.
Yeah.
Right? And then there's chosen ones in the generations, and he's choosing these individuals, and then eventually these larger groups out of many to be the chosen people. And so it's following that. But what I find so interesting too is that it's not just telling us about the chosen lineage. It's telling us about, like, everyone.
Yeah.
Right. This and some of this is a sort of a repeat of the Table of Nations in Genesis, but like, if you read through this, you start saying, oh, look, here's Egypt, right? Egypt was a person in this lineage, right? All of the nations are like just like Israel is the namesake of a person that they're descended from. So there's Egypt, oh, there's Canaan, Cush and Midian, and you start seeing these even in the first chapter. And what's interesting too is like, these are the people that, like, Israel fights with.
Yeah.
A lot.
But they're their family.
But they're their family, right? Yeah, exactly. And I think that we take for granted too, as a modern audience, just how crazy it would be for them to essentially be postulating that all of these nations around them are all really their distant relatives, and they all descended from the same ancestors.
Yes. And
that's not something the other nations were saying. The other nations were saying, no, we came from some divine place and you guys didn't. And that's why we have a right to treat you like we do. But Israel's saying we all came from a divine lineage, and we're all brothers and sisters, right?
Yeah.
And what that also does is it means that whenever we see these narratives of like when Israel's attacked by the Amalekites or enslaved by the Egyptians, or when they're attacking people, when they're attacking the Canaanites, when they're attacking Midian, that it's all this sort of it paints a more sort of tragic picture of what's going on. Of man, this is like sibling. This is like a family feud. These are brothers and sisters that are fighting against one another right now. Not just nations at war, but siblings that are killing one another. And so it's like this really. It can be easy to think that the Bible's very like glorifying of those things, but these genealogies remind us of how like unfortunate that reality is, and in that sense it's reminding us of all of these nations that are their siblings that they're in a violent relationship with, and in that sense it's reminding you of that hope that the nations might all come together in peace, that someone might be able to have peaceful relations with all those nations.
Yeah.
And that's what it means to me. That's one of the big things that jumps out to me. It's something that I've recently had my eyes open to about genealogies. I mean, there's the descendants of Ishmael in here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ishmael, we learned something really interesting. Ishmael had 12 sons,
Wow.
like Israel did. He was like a proto-Israel
Yeah.
because God promised. He
Yeah.
made a promise to Ishmael
Yeah,
that
he
he
did.
would be the father of nations as well. And so what we're seeing is, oh look, God fulfilled that promise to Ishmael.
When we look at that genealogy, we see that
Yeah,
God fulfilled his promise even to Ishmael. It's true. That's so.
yeah.
Oh,
And
it's
that's like, oh, wow. I don't know. It's just like I'm loving genealogies more and more. Like,
yeah. Because when you really pay attention, you see God even in that. Like you see God in his character and who he is, even in that
right,
sense. Like is what is a list of names is not just a list of names, it's fulfillment.
right. And
Right?
that's so important too, because Isaac becomes the chosen son who will carry the lineage and carry that promise to the woman and to Abraham. That's what he says. But he says, but I'm not leaving Ishmael out of this. I'm not just abandoning Ishmael.
Yeah, yeah.
I made a promise to him too. And so it also shows that God's not just faithful to Israel,
He's
right?
faithful in general.
He's just like that promise to Abraham, right? To be a blessing to all the nations. It's just a reminder that all of these nations, it's not just about Israel. It's keep these genealogies also keep the other nations on our radar to remind you that they're all descendants of the woman too.
Yeah. It just reminds you that God is just faithful. That's who he
Yeah,
is.
yeah,
Right? So that's so good, Ben. Yeah, like what I noticed, or I guess my answer would be like, because the reason you gave is crazy profound, amazing. Like, and there's many reasons why genealogy is important, but me thinking about it, as I'm thinking about it, um, I just like I told you before, like there's just so much we can learn from studying the past. There's so
yeah,
much that we can learn and grasp and like see so much wisdom we can receive from just studying the past, right? um like if you look at that genealogy, you even see
yeah.
Nimrod's in there. Like it mentions him in First Chronicles 1:10. Says he's the first person on earth to be a mighty man, and when we read about him in Genesis, it says he was a mighty hunter, right? We see Peleg in there, which we read about him or them in Genesis chapter 10, right before the Tower of Babel, which is where God confused the languages and caused a separation or scattering of the people. And we just read in Chronicles that the Bible just says that he lived in the days where the earth was divided. Doesn't tell us much more about him. It
Mhm.
just says he lived in those days where the earth was divided. Then we read even about Achan, which remember Achan, Bible says he's the troubler of Israel. And after Israel raided Jericho, because he stole some things that were devoted to God and hid them in the tent. And
Mhm.
then that this action affected the nation of Israel. It caused them to lose their next battle against AI. And God ends up saying, it's kind of snitching, but not snitching, but saying like it was because there was sin in the camp. So then Achan admits to it. He's the one that stole this artifacts, I guess, and they stone him and they kill his whole family because of what he did. And they even mention him, this
Mm.
troubler, in the genealogy. So just by looking at these men, like these
Yeah.
three, just these three examples I just gave, right, that we encounter in this genealogy recap, you have someone who seems like he's being praised, Nimrod, the mighty hunter. You have someone who's identified more by the things that happened around them or happened to them than anything they personally did, which is Peleg. And then you have someone who's known for bringing trouble and death to God's people with his greed and idolatry,
Mm.
Achan. So genealogy points out how God has used every single story, from the great hunter Nimrod to the terrible Achan to the person who doesn't do anything history considers significant, Peleg, that he saw everyone and that
Mm.
he still sees everyone, and that they are all written into God's story of redemption. And us today are living out that story too.
Mm.
So this is just one of the reasons why genealogy is so important. Like
I
God
really,
considers every person and every story.
yeah. I really like also the things Lindsay was pointing out
Yeah,
here. Like reminding you of that bigger picture, right? It's helpful to see the bigger picture. It's helpful to be reminded of that big picture, that this started with all nations, and Israel was chosen out of those nations, and like Abraham was chosen out of those nations. But even from that point, was to eventually reach the nations. So it's a reminder of that big picture. And like she said in her other message here, it's also like you were saying, a reminder of the promises, right? He made a promise to Abraham that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. There it is. There's 9 chapters of his descendants, right? Well, not all of them are, but I mean, his descendants, Abraham starts halfway through chapter 1, so it's essentially 9 chapters of
yeah,
his descendants, right? And so it's in that way. It's just what she pointed out was great, of like that promise too being fulfilled.
yeah, yeah. Definitely Adams, for sure.
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
Adams, but like I said,
yeah,
Abraham's
yeah,
descendants
for
begin
sure.
in verse 28 of chapter 1 of Chronicles.
Yeah, 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 for sure. So absolutely, so like, but yeah, look at that. In a list of names that can seem so insignificant that we're tempted to skip over, we see that God keeps his promise.
Yeah.
He is faithful. That he sees everyone, every story matters. All in a list of names. Because it's not just a list of names. It's meant to show us that God is a promise keeper
Mm.
and that he's faithful. And that's beautiful. You
Hmm.
know? So it's just about changing your perspective when you look at this. You know?
Yeah.
Thank you, Lindsay. I appreciate it. That was
Thank you,
wonderful.
Lindsay.
Um, so then that will bring us back into the next section of Chronicles, which is First Chronicles chapters 10 through 29, which is stories of David, stories about David. So we will recognize. I'll just put that back up here just so you guys to see. Yeah. So we went genealogies, First Chronicles chapter 10 to 29, stories about David. That's where we're at now. And like I said, we will recognize most of these stories from the books of Samuel, but again, we'll see some important differences. Um, we see that the author leaves out a lot of the negative stories about David, stories where he's portrayed as weak or immoral. So we don't get the story about David being persecuted and chased by Saul, or the story of adultery with Bathsheba, the murder of Uriah. We get stories, majority stories that portray David in a positive light, right? So chapters 22 to 29 tell us about preparations for the temple, how David started preparations for the temple. He arranges resources, builders, Levites for the temple. It says he even had a worship team. He organized a worship team. He had temple musicians, songwriters, which it actually calls them musical prophets. So I was like, wow, that's kind of profound. I was telling Ben to encourage the worship team, to encourage an unshaken generation that worship on Thursdays. In the temple, musicians and songwriters were considered musical prophets. So
Music.
musical mouthpieces, musical versions of God's mouthpiece. So hopefully
Well,
that
we'll see. I mean, like Hebrew poetry is very common in the books of the prophets. So
Yeah,
they're artistic people.
yeah, for sure. But hopefully it encourages you, changes your perspective on you're not just singing a song or playing a song, right? Like we're God's mouthpiece in in a musical perspective, I guess. That's wonderful. That's probably beautiful. I just want to point it out. Being, as being the worship team on the worship team together. um, but we also see in chapter 28, we see David portrays Moses. I'm sorry, David as a Moses-like figure. And I'm gonna post the verses here, Ben, and I'll have you read them. Give me one moment here, and it should post without breaking up. At least the Facebook one. Oh man, almost. It's okay. The other ones will work out.
Okay.
I'll post the other ones too. So Chronicles 28, 11 through 19.
All right. Then David gave his son Solomon the plans for the portico of the temple, its buildings, its storerooms, its upper parts, its inner rooms, and the place of atonement. He gave him all the plans. He gave him the plans of all that the Spirit had put in his mind for the courts of the temple of the Lord and all the surrounding rooms, for the treasuries of the temple of God, and for the treasuries for the dedicated things. He gave him instructions for the divisions of the priests and Levites. Is this my next one here?
Levites, yeah, the last. I'll click it for you. I'll
Okay.
click it for you here. Hold on. No, sorry, wrong one. See, and it's service, right?
Ending on Levites.
Levites, there you go. Levites.
Levites. And for all the work of serving, sorry, Levites. I lost my place. I'm so. And for all the work of serving in the temple of the Lord, as well as for all the articles to be used in its service. He
Okay.
designated the weight of gold for all the gold articles to be used in various kinds of service. The weight of gold for the gold lampstands and their lamps, with the weight for each lampstand and its lamps, and the weight of silver for each silver lampstand and its lamps, according to the use of each lampstand. The weight of gold for each table for consecrated bread, the weight of silver for.
Oh my gosh, this is terrible. I didn't even think it did the whole thing. Silver, right here, go.
The weight.
I got
The
you,
weight
got
of
you.
silver for the silver lamps, the silver tables. The weight of pure gold for the forks, sprinkling bowls, and pitchers, the weight of gold for each gold dish, the weight of silver for each silver dish, and the weight of the refined gold for the altar of incense. He also gave him the plan for the chariot, that is, the cherubim of gold that spread their wings and overshadowed the ark of the covenant of the Lord. All this, David said, I have in writing as a result of the Lord's hand on me, and he enabled me to understand all the details of the plan.
Okay. Sorry, that didn't work out like I thought it would.
Oh no, it's all right though. I mean, it's really. I mean, it just like again, it's like this is really important stuff to the author.
Yeah, for sure. And the reason why I'm pointing out that he portrays David as a Moses-like figure, what do these instructions remind you of? Going back to Torah, going back to Moses, right? And
Mhm.
it kind of sounds like God is giving David plans for building the temple, just as he did to Moses for building the tabernacle.
Yeah.
So it's very tabernacle instruction esque, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, that's really profound that he's including um, this instruction that God gave David, which David in turn just gives to Solomon, right? Like kind of like it reminds you of Moses, and like being someone, especially from like tabernacle vibes. That's right, tabernacle vibes for sure. Nah, so um
That's the idea.
yeah, so like just being someone like that's Hebrew, like this author or anyone who would read this, they're absolutely yes, they're gonna think of David of because it's mentioning David, but 100% if we notice that, right? They absolutely notice that. Like that's absolutely something that probably is profound to them or they see and they're like, oh wow, like just like Moses, So I think that's super, super profound. So That will lead us up to our next discussion question, which is, why does the author mention all of these new stories details about David?
Hmm.
And not only that, then why does he also, like we discussed, leave a lot of the negative stories out? What do you think, Ben?
Well, yeah, people can please weigh in on this
Yes,
too.
audience.
And I'll just fill some time as you guys are typing, but with my own response. Yeah, I mean, so I think that it actually, it can feel troublesome of like almost like, is there something like sneaky going on? Like, why is he not telling us about the bad things about David? Um, the thing is that it's important to remember, one, those things are recorded, and the author knows that, right? The author, these scrolls were not written in a vacuum. I mean, even Kings references some other scroll several times of like, I don't need to tell you more about this king, it's already written over there, right? Like, and so in that same way, Chronicles is aware of the other texts which record the things about David, and it's not trying to cover up some kind of like the problems that David got himself into.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, everything's intentional, and so the question is, for whatever it may be that the author is attempting to communicate and attempting to focus on, those stories must not be worth mentioning with that focus in mind. And that helps us understand too, what is that focus, right? And so I think that what's one of the things that's going on too is just the fact that the author is focusing on a future hope, right? And so, and that future hope is connected to David, but not connected to David's failures, but they're connected to David's successes. They have this future hope for a messianic king. And if you're hoping, what are you hoping for from that messianic king? Not that he's going to be like David in the bad ways, but that he'll be something like David in the good ways. And
Yes.
so it's reminding us of those good things about David, right? Of
Yeah.
those of the messianic king parts of David, the things we liked about David,
Yeah.
right? Because if we're supposed to be thinking about, oh, what's this king going to look like? It's going to, if he looks anything like David, it's going to look like the good parts of David.
Yeah.
So the king, so the author of Chronicles doesn't need to waste paper and ink and time and effort repeating stories that aren't important to that focus, that are already recorded in something else that his readers can, that you can go read, that the people of the time would have had and could go read, if you know. So I absolutely don't think that, as much as it can be suspicious to us, that the author is meaning to cover anything up, because he's not. He
Yeah, exactly.
in fact, I think the fact that he's silent on those things is a sign that he's not trying to cover them up, right? He's not trying to say, oh, that those things didn't happen. He's not saying, oh, those were like, there's a misunderstanding there or something like that, right? He's
Yeah.
just not, he's just, they're not the focus. They're not important to what he's focusing on. Not to
Exactly.
mention that while what's interesting is that while that's like a bad, like what we might call, right, it's like a bad thing about a king that was left out of Chronicles, there are good things about kings in the Book of Kings that were apparently left out of Kings.
Yeah,
That
the Book of Chronicles that were left out of Kings. Yeah, for
right.
sure.
A notable example is Manasseh, and I had the privilege of being given a note, and that from one of our viewers who was watching, and when I talked about the Manasseh, who was like one of the worst kings of Judah, or of entire Israel, that in Second Chronicles, because you remember me telling you guys about how there's this theme in Kings of we seeing that God wants them to repent, and that when they do, he respects that, he meets them, he shows mercy, he shows love, right? Well, what we learn in Chronicles is that Manasseh actually had a moment of repentance towards the end of his life as well,
Yes.
which God showed mercy even on Manasseh.
Yes.
And so the author of Kings clearly didn't see fit to focus on that at that time, because he's looking that book's leading into exile. But that's obviously becomes much more important when you're thinking about the promises of God, that even the worst king, when he turns back to God, God doesn't turn his back to him,
Yeah.
right?
So good.
And so I think that's also a great illustration of how how Kings and Chronicles, while covering some of the same events, have different focuses, and that means they're just going to, like, it takes up a lot of effort to write things down.
Yeah.
Right? And so if it's already written down, you're only going to include it in your record if it's important to what you're focusing on.
Yeah. If it's important to your overall message
Right.
and what you're trying to say. Like, it's not just about what you're writing down. Like, what you're trying to say is not just made up of what he's writing down. It's made up of why he's writing it down.
Yeah. And I guess I just realized I was being a little jumbled about that, but like the note that was
Yeah.
handed to me was linking to the verses in Chronicles where we learn that about Manasseh, and how beautiful that is, that we see that even the worst king can turn back to God and receive God's love and mercy.
Yeah. Super powerful. So great, And yeah, like, ditto to everything you said. Online audience, you can answer too. We
I
want your,
know.
that's where we giving your time too.
Yeah,
It's like,
I like kind of draw my answer out.
but yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying. Ditto to everything you said. Like, it's it's not anything deceptive. It's not a deceptive move. Like, because honestly, too, like, they can just go back and read First and Second Samuel too. Like, we can do that.
Right.
Like, it's all in there too. The author's just trying to portray David as this, like you said, this ideal king that the future Messiah would come from.
Mm-hmm.
Like, would come down from the line of. So the author's portraying David as sort of this foreshadowing of this messianic king. You know, um, so that's the reason why, it's focusing, really, honestly, it's not even really about, we're reading about David, but the reasoning why it's putting in there is not about David.
Right.
It's about this king. It's about this promise, right?
Yeah,
So
what are we hoping for?
what are we hoping for?
We're not hoping for a repeat of the Bathsheba story.
Oh yeah, we're not hoping for that again.
Yeah.
Like, not trying to do that, But Chronicles also reiterates, um I'm sorry, Second Samuel chapter 7, when God does give David this covenant promise of the messianic king. So just a quick recap of what's going on. When he gives him this promise, David wants to build this temple, right? He wants to build a temple for the ark to rest in. He's like, man, I live in this castle, and meanwhile the ark of the covenant is in this tent, you know. And you see, like, so then God gives David this covenant promise through the prophet Nathan, gives him this word and this promise. And this time, for real, Ben, I separated it well. Okay,
All
I
right. All right. No,
promise it'll be good. I'll post them here, and if you can read that for me, I'll highlight them as we go.
all right. First Chronicles 17. Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. You are not the one to build me a house to dwell in. I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought Israel up out of Egypt to this day. I have moved from one tent site to another, from one dwelling place to another. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their leaders, whom I commanded to shepherd my people, why have you not built me a house of cedar?
Okay, then this one. There you go.
Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name like the names of the greatest men on earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also subdue all your enemies. I declare to you that the Lord will build a house for you. When your days are over and you go to be with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build
Sorry. The one who
sorry, he is the one who will build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. I will never take my love away from him, as I took it away from your predecessor. I will set him over my house and my kingdom forever. His throne will be established forever.
Amen. So it's really profound that he mentions this again. Again, we learn about this author. He's not mentioning it just to mention it, right? Understanding again, bring it back to the context, bring it back to this author, the timeline they're living in. They're living in times, the author living in the times that they're in knows that neither David nor Solomon nor any of the kings from his line were the messianic king. So this author knows that though it might sound like God's talking about Solomon, he's not talking about Solomon.
Solomon thought he was talking about Solomon.
No, Solomon thought he was talking about Solomon. Not talking about Solomon, right? So he knows that neither David nor Solomon nor any of the kings from his line were the messianic king. Like he has his eyes have not seen this king yet. The people have not seen this king yet. But that when the Messiah does come, he will be a king like David. Like you said, the successful parts of David, from the line of David. And these stories about David from the past are what will sustain the people's hope for a future. It's the foreshadowing of the hope that is the messianic king to come. And honestly, like we said, he's not trying to, the author is not being deceptive, not trying to hide David's history, and couldn't if he even tried. Like it's there already. We know what happens with David. But still in all, even Israel knowing, these people knowing David's flaws, what has happened, in even us today, as we read the word, right, as we read in the Bible, to this day, Israel considers David their greatest king, like physical king, like of all time, even with the stuff that has happened and his flaws and his downfalls, his big downfalls, right? So even knowing all of that, they still consider him the greatest king that they've ever had. And this is the type of king that the chronicler is trying to show, that this messianic king is coming from this line of our greatest king, our greatest physical king that we've had. So he's basically shaping David to be a foreshadow of the true messianic king that's going to come.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Anything you want to add, Ben? I was going to call you Ryan for a second. That's his name. You want to add, Ben?
I don't think so. No, I think that you hit the nail on the head there.
Ready. So let's keep going. So the third section of Chronicles is or the structure of the third section, I guess the way it's structured, is Second Chronicles chapters 1 through 36. That's the whole book. Second Chronicles is the kings in Jerusalem. So now we're getting into the rest of the kings. Mostly focus on the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah.
Mhm.
You do hear about some kings from the northern kingdom here, but you only hear about them only if they had any type of interaction or any type of encounter with a king from the southern kingdom, from Judah. So I'm gonna show you a list of the names of the kings, a list of names of the kings. You're not gonna see all of the northern kingdom kings, is because, like I said, I'm not mentioning all the kings, just the ones that from the north that had interactions with the kings from the south, basically. So
And that's because that's the only ones Chronicles mentions.
yes, they're the only ones that Chronicles mentions. So I'm only mentioning the northern kingdom kings that Chronicles mentions.
Right.
So keep note of that. So yeah, the first ones we'll get into is the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom. Now, again, the chronicler does not pay a whole lot of attention to the rulers of the Northern Kingdom. Like I said, I'll only be mentioning the ones mentioned in Chronicles. You can get more stories about them in the Book of Kings, right? Like Venom went over, and you'll also see writings about them in the books of the prophets. Um, the author again focuses a lot more on the kings of the Southern Kingdom, and again, only mentions them, the Northern Kingdom kings that had encounters with the Southern Kingdom kings. So I'll put their names up here. These are the kings of Israel we bump into in the Book of Chronicles. Um, we see, which I have like a little bit of descriptions of each one, so I'll go through that really quickly. So just to give us a refresher on these kings, who they were. Um, we have King Jeroboam. Who's King Jeroboam? Remember him from we remember him from Kings, or was it Samuel?
No, it was from Kings. He's the
Kings,
first.
right? Kings.
Yeah, he's like the first king of the Northern Kingdom.
Yes, yes, that's when we get the split. So Jeroboam, he objects to King Rehoboam, which was Solomon's son, right?
Yeah.
Policy, and decides to leave Judah and take 10 tribes with him. So he sets himself up as the first ruler of the northern kingdom of Israel. And though he tries to call a truce with Rehoboam, it doesn't work out. It ends badly. Jeroboam rises up and rebels against the Lord. Later, he starts to worship other gods and get taken down by Judah in battle. And then God kills him. So that's how it ends. King Basha, um, in an effort to prevent anyone from going in and out of the territory of Judah, he builds like this wall, this blockade. Um, but he has to abandon his blockade plans when the folks in Aram decide to come after him. He assassinated King Nadab, which is Jeroboam's son, King Solomon's. Oh no, not King Solomon. Sorry, Jeroboam's son. See, these names sound alike, so it's kind of confusing. To take the throne, and God pronounced judgment and destruction on his family. So he lives a while, but God passes judgment on him because he just was disobedient. It's not a good king. King Ahab, we've Ben took some time on him. He is really bad. They were the worst. I think him and Manasseh fight for the top. I think Ahab's worse, honestly. But anyway, that's just my opinion. He's by far one of the most terrible kings in the history of Israel. He worships Baal. He ignores the advice of God's prophets. He kills prophets. His kids manage to start ruining things in Judah too. Eventually, he's killed in battle because God had enough of him. And don't get me started on his wife Jezebel. He was a truly wicked king. King Ahaziah. Um, we don't know much about him. The chronicler doesn't tell us much about this king except to say that he did wickedly. That's what it says. That he did wickedly, and as punishment, God destroys a fleet of ships he built with the king of Judah. And what's really sad is that it was the first time they took the ships out, and he destroyed them the first time they took them out to sea. You got King Joram. We read that King Joram was sick. We read that the Armenians wounded him, and that his nephew, King Jehoram of Judah, a king of the south, goes to visit him in Samaria because he was sick. But we learn in Second Kings that one of his generals murdered him while he was recuperating. That's a sad way to go. But that's what goes on with Joram. And King Jehu, this is the guy, the only king. I would say he's all right. He's all right. this this king is the guy the Lord had anointed. We read the Lord had anointed him to destroy the house of Ahab. So he takes Ahab out basically. And since Ahab's relatives had infiltrated the throne in Judah, Jehu had to clean house there as well. So, but after he was obedient to God in wiping out Ahab and anyone that was for him, he continued to worship golden calves and idols. And yeah, his disobedience makes him a not good king at the end of the day. So those are the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel that we see mentioned in Chronicles. Next, we'll go into the obedient kings of Judah. So now, again, the chronicler really focuses on the southern kingdom. Um, he highlights the kings that were obedient to God, and we see new stories about their obedience and how that leads to success in God's blessing. But he also highlights how there were disobedient kings in Judah as well, right? And how that them not following the Torah and being unfaithful to God and leading Israel to worship idols, that these kings face horrible consequences. And that all leads up to Israel's exile as well. So first, we'll get into the obedient kings. We have King Abijah. Um, he defeated Israel in battle and was described as a ruler who grew strong. King Jehoshaphat, he was one of the first major kings after Solomon. He worshiped God and made sure the people did too. He also tried to get a truce between Israel and Judah. Didn't work out well in the end, but at least he tried. He also had. It also says, we also read in Chronicles that he had great riches and honor, which I guess that's where the comparison to Solomon comes from. King Jotham. We don't get a lot of info on him either, but what we do hear, the little we do here is good. It says he built towers, defeated enemies, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. And that's a lot more than I can say for some of the other kings. So he's a good king. We get King Hezekiah. Um, we read that many generations later that this king restored the temple in Jerusalem to its former glory. Um, King Hezekiah started Passover celebrations in Jerusalem. He tried to unite the north and the south again by calling a truce and throwing a huge party. Tried to make it happen. He also managed to defeat the Assyrian Empire, which is the feat that the northern kingdom couldn't manage. Like they got pummeled. They could not manage that. Um, and we read that he got sick, but that he also humbled himself, so then God healed him. Um, and the last obedient king we read about is King Josiah. King Josiah, I remember Pastor preached about him. He was only 8 years old when he took over control of Judah, but he
Yeah.
quickly became a royal powerhouse, you can say. So not only did he walk in the ways of, it says in Chronicles that he walked in the ways of his ancestor David, which is huge, right? Considering what we know the author is trying to say about what he's trying to say about David. Um, but he destroyed all the idols in Judah. He continued the Passover celebrations that Hezekiah initiated, and he even discovered a new book of laws written by Moses. In the end, he ignored a couple warnings from God and was killed in battle, but all in all, he was a decent king. So those are the obedient kings of Judah that we read of. We also, again, we read of the disobedient kings, and we'll see when that Ben mentioned earlier that repented and had redemption. Um, but the disobedient kings we read about here, we have King Asa. Um, we read that he's actually pretty faithful for most of his life. That he hates other gods so much that he even kicks out his own mother from worshiping idols. Like he said, "You got to get out of here, ma, worshiping these idols." Um, and he has some victories in battle, but then he gets an alliance going with Aram, and this does not make God happy. So when Asa gets sick and he doesn't seek the Lord, we read in chapter 16, we read that God lets him die. And yeah, that's the end of King Asa. Um, King Joash, um, we read he has a kind of rocky start in life. He was almost killed by his grandmother, but then he was whisked away to be raised in the temple for 7 years. And once he gets his chance to sit on the throne, we read that he restores God's house to its former glory. But later in life, he has a change of heart, and that he abandoned. We read in Chronicles, it says that he abandoned the house of the Lord and served the sacred poles and idols, the Asherah poles, the Baal idols. Um, and after he kills the son of a high priest, he's also a prophet. Um, After that, he was wounded in battle, and we read that his officials conspired against him and assassinated him at Beth Milion, the road down to Stilla. So that's pretty profound. Um,
Hmm.
Way to go. We have King Uzziah. Um, he did good things too, like winning wars, building armies, and he worshiped God. But then he got very prideful. You can say cocky. Um, we read that he barges into the temple, demands to enter the special holy places reserved for the priests, like the Holy of Holies stuff. And in the end, a leprous disease broke out on his forehead. And because God sees this as a major violation of temple protocol.
Hmm.
Last but not least, King Manasseh. Overall, a lot of what we read in Kings is that he's very disobedient. Um, Up there with Ahab on one of the worst kings. So we see that he starts worshiping other gods. So God sends the Assyrian Empire to teach him a lesson. It says that God using this Assyrian Empire to teach him a lesson. And after he's captured, it says he's sent into exile as a prisoner. And we read in Chronicles that that is where there in prison is where Manasseh has a change of heart. Like that maybe Yahweh is right after all. And we see that he repents. He asks God for forgiveness and God gives it to him. Chronicles does tell us that he comes into repentance, and it also says that he says that the Lord indeed was God. So that's just a quick recap on these kings that we read about. Um, so yeah, like the kid Matt so silly is that you say
Yeah, I'm laughing about.
about Joash, he was almost killed by his grandma so nonchalantly. That's a rough start, all right. It's to mention it quickly, like to throw a little seed there of interest for you guys to go read it on your own. Go
Yeah,
read it.
it's actually yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a thing.
It's
We didn't really cover it in Kings, and she's like the granddaughter of like Ahab or something. She's related to the Northern Kingdom.
oh, so it's in her blood.
Yeah.
It's a family thing, right? But I mentioned these kings and I went through these quick little character recaps and like, I guess descriptions. And if you want that, I can send that to you. Let me know. I can definitely get that to you guys. Um, because to kind of just point out to you that this section becomes like when we're mentioning these kings, like in Chronicles talking about these kings, it becomes a series of character studies in a sense. The author wants the later generations to learn from their family and their government history so they can learn to become faithful to God and the Torah and the law.
Mhm.
Like we're going to focus on these disobedient kings and see how it leads to destruction, but focus on these disobedient kings to see where how it leads to destruction, and it led to our exile. And I'm gonna focus on these obedient kings so you can see how important it is for us to be obedient to God and the law, you
Mhm.
know? So he's not just mentioning them just for a history lesson. Again, it's not just about what he's writing, but about why he's writing it.
Yeah, and that the messianic king that we're waiting for, these are the like must there must be something about these kings that are like that messianic king,
Hmm.
right? That we're if we're trying to imagine what we're expecting, it's there's going to be some sort of qualities that are present in these kings.
Yes, for sure. So yeah, again, it's not just what he's writing or what he's including, or
The good
why he's including it. You know, so good. I'm sorry.
the obedient kings, I should say,
Yeah,
specify.
yeah, that's what I said. I was gonna write good kings and bad kings. Then I was like, you know what? It's
Yeah.
really more obedient kings and
Hmm.
disobedient kings,
Right.
because it's not like kind of the consequences and the blessings that we see are not based on the fact if that person was good or not or bad or not, because all these kings did good and bad things.
Mhm.
It's about what we really see affect these kings and affect this people, this kingdom, is their obedience or their
Yeah.
love of it.
Because and you see that even with like the bad kings that turn back, that repent, right? Because it's kind of like it, you need to stop. And so in the case of these bad kings that do stop and turn back to God, then it's like great.
Yeah,
That you turn to obedience. But if you don't stop yourself, I'm gonna stop you.
yeah.
Right?
And it just shows us about ourselves and our walk, right? Of
Yeah.
this faith, like we're not good enough.
Mhm.
Like we'll never be good enough. That's why the Messianic King had to come.
Mhm.
He's good enough, right?
And
So we'll never
and
be
when
about
we and he meets us when we turn around, when we
exactly.
turn back to him, then he meets us where we're at.
So God is not, God. Bible says God is good. Like
Yeah.
only
Right.
He's good, and it also says that anything that is good in us comes from God because it came from God, right? So if we're not measured by
Mhm.
us being good or bad, we can't be perfect. We're not good. God is good. We're not
Mhm.
inherently good. Only God is, but we can be obedient. we do have a choice.
Right.
We can see and experience and taste how good God is when we are obedient to Him, you know? And like that, even the recap, the whole Bible points to this, you know? But even the recap here, they're hearing about these kings, shows us that, like, in your obedience is where we please God. In our
Yeah.
obedience, where we please God. We'll never be good enough, but we can be obedient, you know?
Mhm.
And when we are, we taste and see how good He is,
Mhm.
you know? So,
It's kind of like right, the Abraham believes God and it's credited to him as righteousness, right? Like that's what God's like. I just like if you can trust me and work with that, right? I don't need you to suddenly be perfect. I can work with you if you're going to trust me.
yeah. And it's
And
just in
that's
the,
related to obedience, of course. Is to have obedience. There's a level of faith, right?
yeah,
So yeah, it's
yeah, exactly. So it's in the obedience, you know? We can be obedient, like, that's that's what it's about, you know? So for us, we can be obedient. We choose God. We can taste how good He is, you know?
yeah.
So,
Um,
mhm.
uh, Matt was just sharing a section from Chronicles here. He shared First Chronicles 21, and this is actually a good reminder too that while the author doesn't bring up all of the negative beats of David's message of David's life, he brings up some of them. He's not devoid of, and this is an example of when David takes a census, which it's sort of a rabbit hole of why that's a bad thing, but essentially just imagine a governmental authority essentially saying we're going to increase taxes and draft your children into the army, right? Um, uh, and so when he brings the census, it brings a level of justice from God. But as Matt has pointed out, in that case, we also see David repents, he turns back to God, and God relents of the justice and the punishment that was coming upon him for it.
Yeah,
Just that repeated theme that we even saw in Kings, right?
yeah, for sure.
Throughout really the entire Bible, after all. So
Yeah. So how we're getting to the end of Chronicles. We got through basically the structure. Um, the end of Chronicles, how Chronicles concludes is we read about King Cyrus, the king of the Persians, right? Um, and we read how he tells the Israelites that they can go back home, return from exile, rebuild the city and the temple. And I just gonna share the verse here, Ben. You can read that with me.
the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord their God be with them.
And that's the last verse in
Which is
Second Chronicles. It just like that, it ends. It just ends.
again, he's not. I don't believe these authors waste time, right?
No, no.
What they put in is important. What they leave out is important. And here he's like, and that's it. That's a good end right there.
And he ends it with a cliffhanger, like no response back to King Cyrus. We don't know if anybody said anything to him after that.
Right.
That's it. This
Yeah,
is
it's a
how,
cliffhanger. It's like, okay, that's cool, but wait, what happened? Did people do it?
yeah. Like, did they go back? Did they build it? Um, that's how we'll read it. We haven't in our order of our Bible. We
Right.
haven't gotten to the rest of it, right? But remember, though Chronicles comes after Samuel and Kings in our Bibles, it is the last book in the Jewish order of the Old Testament.
Mhm.
So this author already knows about their first return from exile and the stories of the prophet Ezra and Nehemiah and other prophets. But in the author's view, like, he knows they went back and rebuilt Jerusalem and they rebuilt the temple. Like, those that
And
happened,
so
right?
do his readers, most
Yes,
likely.
for his
They
readers.
know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, like, in this author's view, the prophetic hopes of Israel that we read about so far and that we will read about in the major minor prophet books as we journey through the Old Testament, have not yet been fulfilled in their entirety.
Mhm.
So this incomplete cliffhanger ending shows that the author's hope is set on a promise that is to come. When
Yeah,
the
I think.
messiah, go ahead.
Sorry,
You
I
go.
think that like a good way to see that, if it's hard, is that you're thinking about the way that this ended, right? And you can just go through a sort of a thought process for it, right? He ends on this like it seems like a hope that the temple would be rebuilt, but that seems like an odd hope to end on when you know that he knows that that's already happened and his readers probably know that that's already happened. So then what is he actually hoping for if it's not just the rebuilding of the temple? He must be saying that there's something beyond that, that even the rebuilding of the temple itself is pointing towards.
Yes.
Or that in a way the temple hasn't really been rebuilt, not as he finds it significant.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Like it seems to be rebuilt, but it's not rebuilt in the way
Right.
that it was promised to be rebuilt. So yeah, like this cliffhanger ending shows that the author's hope is set on a promise that is to come, when the messianic king will finally come to truly rebuild the temple and restore God's people. So Chronicles basically is calling God's people to look back in order to look ahead, because the past has become a source of hope for the future. So, and that's how the chronicle ends. I just want to end the Bible study with our last discussion question here. And I would love, again, input from you guys at home and from, of course, Ben here. But the discussion question is, what does hope look like while we are waiting on God's promises?
Mm.
So I actually put this one, and I think you see a little better in this one. What does hope look like while we're waiting on God's promises?
It's a very like like a practical question. Like this is a
Yeah.
very one that was like, what does this look like for us?
Well, talking about, I guess, what we read today too, right? Like, or how can we have hope while waiting to see what God has promised to come to pass? Or when it seems like we have seen glimpses, but not the complete fulfillment of his promises. Like this author, right? That he's seen the temple rebuilt and Jerusalem rebuilt, but there's still chaos and no messianic king, right? So how can we have hope while waiting to see what God has promised to come to pass? Or when we can see glimpses, but we haven't seen the complete fulfillment of it. What does hope look like while we're waiting on God's promises?
Mhm. I think that it's something that it's a question that's really because we're in many ways we're in a completely different situation to the people in that situation, and then at the same time we can empathize maybe a little bit because we're also waiting,
Yeah, we
right?
are.
Like the Messiah has come, but the Messiah will return, and we're waiting for that. And this can still feel like, man, it's chaotic. It's not great out here sometimes, a
Yeah.
lot of the time, right? And we're still waiting. And so it's one of those things that's actually so relevant to modern Christians, right? There's there's a lot of fulfillment, right? We saw, and that's and we in, that we saw, but there's still more promises that were made that we're waiting on the fulfillment for. And I think in the same way as what this author's doing is what we have is to look back, and when we have doubts because it's scary out here, and we look and we say, is it really, is that, are we really going to get there? We look back and it's like, well, we got through all this. He fulfilled all these promises. There's more promises that he's fulfilled than that we're still waiting on,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So then I think is reminding ourselves by reading the scriptures and looking back on the scriptures and the stories that it tells of, look at the promises that God made and look at him fulfill them. He made this promise to Abraham and look at the nations. He made this promise to Ishmael and look at his descendants. He made this promise for us, we get to say he made this promise to David, and look, he made all of this little huge list of things that were fulfilled in Jesus, right? And so how could we look at that list and say, well, maybe he won't be faithful this time.
Yeah.
Maybe he won't fulfill his promise this time. And then even outside of scriptures, many of us have the ability to look back on our own lives and say, yeah, he was faithful and he was trustworthy. That
Yeah.
even when it didn't make sense to me, it I ended up in a good place. I saw the wisdom of it afterwards. I at least saw some of the wisdom of it afterwards, right? So I can like just reminding ourselves of we have reason, every reason to trust him. Way more reason to trust him than we have to trust anything else, to trust any other possible lie that pops up in our head, right?
Yeah.
It's just like if you look at all of this, how can you reason that he wouldn't be faithful, that he wouldn't fulfill his promises? And what I think is amazing too when I think about it is that he fulfilled so many of these promises in Jesus, and we're still waiting on the fulfillment of some more promises that came, right? The fulfillment of those promises in Jesus were surprising to the people of the time who were waiting for him, who were studying the scriptures, it was surprising. Like, whoa, we thought this was going to look different.
Yeah.
Uh, but when they saw him, they're like, oh yeah, I see how that makes sense. Like that's actually what the scriptures were saying. But it was surprising to them, and I think that's an important and humbling reminder to us that we almost certainly are going to be surprised. That we might have an idea of exactly how that's going to
Yeah.
look,
Yeah.
and we may find that not only are we surprised by it, but then also that when it happens, we're going to see, oh, I see how that was what it was saying the whole time.
Yeah. It
Right.
didn't happen the way I thought it would. It didn't look the way I thought it would, but it still came. It still happened. You know.
Right. And so it's like this weird balance, right, of being confident that he will fulfill those promises, but remembering to stay humble about our certainty about how that's going to look.
Yeah. Yeah. Lindsay and Matt, they share some things here, but Lindsay wrote, trusting the promises he has spoken over us will come to pass and staying obedient in the process. Those that wait on the Lord will renew their strength. Amen. And then Matt wrote, bad kings that didn't that didn't have hope and that equal to terrible lives and history even for later generations. And good kings did have hope and they had good lives and even generations to come. So it seems to me that hope looks like obedience. I think for the head, that hope is like obedience. Yeah.
Because
But good.
like yeah, it's actually it's great because we do see that pattern, and it's not as simple as just, oh well, these bad kings didn't have hope, so they were punished for not having hope. It's actually because of their lack of hope that they created a terrible situation. That
Yeah.
it was the northern kingdom's lack of hope that God would save them from Assyria that ultimately got them conquered by Assyria,
Yes. Yeah.
right? Because they were, and we see that repeated not just in Kings, not just in Chronicles, but this of when the hope in God is removed, then they start trying to solve problems by their own human understanding, our own human wisdom, our own human sense of what we might think is right or wrong at that moment, and that leads to more destruction and more like what Matt was saying, right?
Yeah.
Bad
For sure.
misery. um so yeah, I absolutely, and so that obedience, right, like
Yeah.
that comes back to.
You know, reading this, right? And it's great you mentioned Jesus, right? Um, reading just the question and saying like, or like when we have glimpses, but not the complete fulfillment of his promises, right? This reminded me of Matthew chapter 24. I'll never forget 24 because we did a whole series on Matthew and I got it. Matthew 24, it was assigned to me and I was like, oh man, this is the prophetic end times one and I'm scared of it. But in all reality, if you read Matthew 24, Jesus is having this conversation with his disciples. This is the quickest version of it. Read it. Like I don't want to totally like I'm not gonna get to every detail, but um he's having this conversation with his disciples and they basically ask him, Jesus tells them, he tells them, "Do you see all these things? I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." And they ask him, tell us when this will happen. Like, and he's talking about the temple. Jesus talking about the temple. Hold on, guys. I'm sorry. My daughter calling me.
It's okay.
Baby, no, baby. I'm sorry. You can't. I'm sorry, baby. I'm almost done. I'm almost done. I love you. I love you. She's like by the gate. I'm sorry, y'all. Y'all love Raylan. I know you'll probably tell me let her in, but she will. She will make. She will make so much noise. It's insane. Nah, but no. So you see this conversation between Jesus and the disciples, and he's talking about the temple. He's telling them, see this place. Not one stone will be left. And the disciples tell him, "Well, tell us when these things will happen." And you see Jesus telling them about when the temple will be destroyed. But you read the whole chapter, you can clearly see he's not just talking about things that they will see, because they will see the destruction of the temple. He talks about how they will be persecuted and put to death. And we see that the disciples also see that. They also experience that. They are persecuted. Most of them die horrible deaths. They're martyred for the gospel, right? So you read this chapter, you see, now that we know what we know, and if you know the history, you see that about maybe 40 years from then, the temple is destroyed, and these disciples will die and be martyred, and they will be persecuted. But then you also see Jesus talking about what is end times, like what has not happened yet, what we have not seen happen yet. You know, when the Son of Man will come back, he talks about his return, that he's gonna go, but he's gonna come back. So imagine just being all that to say, imagine being those disciples and maybe possibly, most likely, probably seeing this temple be destroyed, right? Seeing persecution that's happening in their natural mind, you're probably thinking, "Oh, Jesus is coming now. He's coming back soon. Like he's coming back really soon. Like my eyes will see it, or at least my kids will see it." But here we are, over 2,000 years later. We know that temple was destroyed. We know the disciples have been persecuted and killed and martyred. We see there's other Christians being persecuted and martyred. We see, in a sense, a not I'm not comparing a persecution that we go through as Christians to the persecution the early Christians went through, but we see like this kind of like this, this this dissension when it comes to Christianity, right? And when it comes to Christ, when it comes to the things of God, right? In this world, right?
Mm-hmm.
We see all these things, but Jesus hasn't come back yet. You know? So like what do we do with that when we see glimpses of what Jesus said would happen, but not his return yet. Not his return. So it kind of just reminded me of that. And I was like, wow, like we kind of, like you said, we're waiting on a promise too.
Right.
We're waiting on our exile, in a sense, of when we exile to, you know, our promised land, to eternal life, to the kingdom of heaven, like the new earth, right? What's all that stuff that's supposed to happen, right? So you think about that, and you're like, what happens when we see glimpses? Like, and even when we think about just promises that God has promised us personally, like not even talking about what we read in the Bible, like I just mentioned now, but personally, like, God, I'm not seeing what you promised me come to pass, or at least I'm not seeing, like I'm not seeing that, like I'm not able to perceive that you fulfill that promise. You know what I mean? Or it's not looking good, God. Like I'm not seeing it. My answer would be like kind of what Lindsay said, to hold on to the promises of God, right? That we walk in, live our lives according to our knowledge of those promises. That we don't just believe with our words, but with our actions. But we prepare for the fulfillment of God's promises. Because if all of this, what we read today and what we read in these to the beginning of the year in this journey through the Old Testament, or when we read through the whole Bible, if it's shown us anything, it's that we can trust God, that He is trustworthy, and that He will fulfill His promises, and that He is a covenant keeper. He does not play with His covenant when it comes to covenant. So if it's been proven time and time again If we've seen it through these stories, if we've seen it through these accounts, through genealogy, through reviewing things again and recaps and everything in the Bible, God has proven himself faithful.
Yeah.
Like he doesn't have to do another thing to prove himself faithful. He's already done it.
And if it doesn't look how we expected it to look, the Bible says par for the course. Right?
For sure. Because
We shouldn't be surprised at being surprised.
exactly, absolutely. But we can for sure know and put our trust in the fact that he is trustworthy and that he is faithful and he's a covenant keeper. He keeps his promises. And that if he said he's gonna do it, he's gonna do it. And that's it. That's the end of Chronicles. That's how we end it.
You know, yeah, that's awesome. You know what it makes me think of is um uh, in in Peter, I think it's Peter's letter, one of Peter's letter, he addresses the church that he's speaking to as like those in exile in Babylon or something like that,
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
That and this church is certainly not people who are in exile in the way that you would think about it, or in Babylon. And it's he's equating, right, this time of this waiting for the fulfillment of the promises to the Israelites in exile. He equates that to the waiting of to Christians in that period of time. And so it's not it's actually the apostles saw this connection as well. And I think that's really profound as well. So I wish I had like all the quote. It just popped into my brain. I apologize. I don't have the first numbers of the exact quoting, but yeah.
No, it's great. But that's the end. That's the end of Chronicles. That's how it ends. Um, Ben did me the amazing favor, and like, thank you so much for fixing these key themes. So here they are. These are the key themes we see in Chronicles. The new ones that we see: the coming of the Messianic King, the hope and future of the temple, and God hears our prayers.
Hmm.
And screenshot it if you like. You can have it. And that's the end of our Bible study. That's the end of Chronicles. So thank you, Ben. Thank you for being here with me. Thank you for helping me with this
You.
at the end. I appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you for joining us. You know what? Raylan, you can come. Raylan.
Thank you guys all for joining us. Thank you guys for commenting and for answering questions, and even if you didn't type in, for being here, for listening, for thinking through the answers, even if you didn't for whatever reason necessarily feel comfortable sharing them. I guess we'll just go through a few announcements.
Yes.
So this Thursday is Encounter Nights. It's the youth and young adult service. The service starts at 7:30. Doors open at 7. And there's also I forgot what they're calling it, but there's for middle schoolers. There's like a Bible school, sort of like.
Yeah, they don't have a name for it yet.
Okay.
Like Pastor was saying that Pastor Daniel was saying we need to come up with a name for it. But yeah, they're gathering.
The middle schooler thing, something thingamabob.
Yeah.
So anyway, but even if you're an adult, you can come worship and hear a word. It's led by the youth, but it's not necessarily just for the youth.
And let me tell you, it has been incredible. So I encourage you highly, please, if you can make it, come to Encounter Nights. You won't see me this week. I'm gonna be away, so don't take my example this week. I'm there all the time though, so please come. I'm only telling you it's really great. It's been really great because I've been there, been able to witness it. You don't want to miss it. It has been so good. So please come, and we'd love to see you there. We
Also, come on Sunday. We have our Sunday service. It starts at 10 a.m. There's also Sunday morning prayer, which begins at 7 a.m. So you can come pray with us. Um, but otherwise, we can see you at 10 a.m. on Sunday, or maybe a little bit before, and you can fellowship, and you can ask us. You can ask me questions if you see me there. You can ask me questions about the Bible, or tell me about some cool stuff that you found. And I love to talk about the Bible. Um, so yeah, there's also is this is
Yes.
current, right? Yeah. Worship After Hours is happening Friday, July 21st, the night of, so open at 11:30. So we'll be worshiping really late or really early, depending on how you organize your sleep.
Yeah. So yes, so worship after hours. Please come. Last time they did this, it was really amazing too. Like it was incredible. Please, if you can make it, please make it a point to come at 11:30. You don't want to miss it. It's great if you're able to come. Our deacon Lindsay, she also just put up here that prayer will be in person next Tuesday.
Mhm.
I have a banner for it too for the Zoom information. I'll put that up now, but for once a month they're doing prayer in person. So if you need the location for prayer in person, she put the number in the
Oh,
comments
sorry.
here. No, it's okay. You're fine. She put a number that you can text for the address if you're interested of attending prayer call in person, which starts at 7:30 p.m. next Tuesday. But if you're not able to make it in person, we have the thing here. You can go and join through Zoom. Prayer call and Bible study alternate on Tuesdays at 8 p.m. So next Tuesday won't be Bible study. We will have prayer call, and again, they will have it in person or through Zoom. So you can dial in, or you can submit prayer requests also on the call, or you can submit prayers to the email tdpprayer@gmail.com. Um, and we'd love to pray for you and pray with you and hear from you. And we hopefully will see you guys there in person, or if not, through Zoom. Um,
Speaking of also looking forward and hopes and announcements and things like that, if you're reading ahead of us in our series, which I really hope that you are, and that's great if you are, I want to give you a fair warning that we will be at this point actually breaking from the order of the books as they are in the Old Testament. So if you are reading ahead of us, I don't want you to be caught off guard by that. So our next Bible study, which will be 2 weeks from now, will actually be covering the book of Jonah. Correct?
yes, the book of Jonah.
So we're at this point not necessarily following the order as they are in the Christian Old Testament or as they are in the Hebrew Bible. Um, Both have their own really good reasons for being organized the way they are, and we have our own, I hope, good reasons for organizing it the way we are in this Bible study.
We do,
Since
we
we are
do.
walking through it, since we are walking through it so narratively focused, we wanted to try to organize books as much in a sort of chronological order in the sense of narrative. Um, so that's why we're going to be going into Jonah next, actually. And we will probably discuss that decision more when we get into it. But I just want, if you're reading ahead of us, read Jonah. It's not long.
No,
So it's not long at all. So if you need more reading, we're going into what let me just check real quick. We're going into Amos and Joel after that.
yeah,
So you need more reading because Jonah's just so short. Amos and Joel, the prophets. So yeah, and it's really exciting. We're getting into like the prophets now, which is really exciting. So it's really new. We're entering a new kind of literature, really, and so that's really exciting for me personally.
yeah.
So
Exciting for me too. Challenging, but
challenging for sure.
but exciting. But thank you, Ben. Thank you for joining me in this Bible study.
Thank you. It's awesome.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone that joined us. We appreciate you. We love you, and we hope you have an absolutely wonderful rest of your night. God bless you guys.
God
Okay.
bless you.
Have a good
Good
night.
night.
Bye.